Depending on where you are in the world, you might be lucky enough to see the iris bloom before it fades for the year. Where I am, they finished in mid-May, but with the change in climate, that might vary for you. The iris is one of those instantly recognisable flowers, showy and bright with its voluminous petals, able to add a splash of colour to any garden. They've actually been beloved by humans for millennia, apparently favoured as far back as ancient Egypt as a decorative device. So how exactly does the iris show up in folklore? Well, let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I do hope that you're well, and we are changing gears slightly for this week's episode because we're now starting a new theme, and I thought I'd do folklore of plants again, because it does feel a while since I've done plants. And there's not really any theme for this one, they're just either plants that bloom at this time of year, or they're a little bit more decorative in some way. So we're going to start off with the iris, because I was quite surprised I actually hadn't covered it before. And I'm not going to do one of my Victorian language of flowers meanings for each episode in this month, because we'll be covering them anyway. So each episode's going to kind of be sponsored by that particular flower anyway, if that makes sense. And before I go any further, this post does not constitute any medical advice. So where it does mention folk medicine, that is for entertainment purposes only. So we're going to start off with the iris in Greek myth. And in Greek myth, the iris is usually attributed to Hera, along with the pomegranate, poppy, dittany and white lily. And Miss Carruthers notes that all of these flowers were later transferred to the Virgin Mary. Yet it's also an interesting association between a goddess and a flower, given Greek myth also features Iris herself, the goddess of rainbows. Iris was also a messenger between the gods and humanity, and she's often depicted as Hera's personal messenger in the later myths. So it's perhaps hardly unsurprising that the iris in the Victorian language of flowers meant a message, though that was probably really unhelpful for someone to send you a message through flowers that essentially tells you it's a message. So yeah, probably best not to use that one. But who was Iris? And I wanted to include her because I feel like she's sort of been forgotten. I'm not going to say erased, but you'll see why I might have thought that in a moment. Because Iris bridges the sea and sky, because her father was a sea god and her mother was a cloud nymph, and her sisters are actually the harpies as well. Now, for anyone who lived at the coast, they actually thought that Iris could transfer seawater into the clouds to create rain, and this is most likely due to rainbows seen over the sea. And in a way, if you've ever studied the water cycle and evaporation and things like that, it's not entirely inaccurate. It's not literally how it works, but you know what I mean? There's some truth to how the seawater ends up becoming clouds again. Now, Iris doesn't actually have any real myths of her own, but she does appear in myths of other gods, often running errands for them. She does appear in the Iliad, but not the Odyssey, which just names Hermes as the messenger god. And this is where I start to get a little bit annoyed that she is really instrumental in quite a lot of myths. She does appear in the Battle of Troy. At one point, she ends up taking a wounded Aphrodite away from the battlefield. But nowadays we only name Hermes as the messenger and Iris is largely forgotten, which I think is something of a shame. Now, while performing her role, Iris didn't actually seem to be limited by where she could go. So she delivered messages between the gods themselves, and she also carried advice to humans. Although, to be fair, she often did this off her own bat and was giving them advice, but she wasn't actually carrying a message from anyone. And when she did this, she would usually do it in disguise, and she would only occasionally appear in her full glory to humans. There does seem to be an element of the trickster about Iris as well, which is why I think it's such a shame that she's sort of been forgotten about. She could actually carry messages beneath the sea, which was probably made easier with her father's role as a sea god. And if a god decided to swear an unbreakable oath on the river Styx, it was Iris who went to the underworld to collect some of the Styx's waters so that the oath could actually be sworn. Now, there is some debate as to whether Iris actually simply personified the rainbow or whether she used rainbows to get around, a bit like a personal road that she could summon when she wanted to travel. When I first read that, I just kind of thought all I can think of is the Rainbow Road level in Mario Kart, which is really hard. But I thought that kind of brings a whole new level of meaning to Nintendo, I think. The idea that you've got this goddess using rainbows to get around, and apparently so does Mario. But Iris also had golden wings, so I think that she did have a few travel options available to her. And it's interesting because she actually started out with winged sandals, a bit like Hermes, and then she ends up with wings of her own. So quite why she needs the rainbow to get around, I'm not sure. But that's not the point. The fact she's linked with the rainbow actually seems to reflect why the iris got its name, because there are so many different colours of irises as flowers, so it really, really well reflects Iris as a goddess of rainbows. And as a side issue, scientists actually named the element iridium after Iris because it produces such colourful salts, which is quite cool. At least she does have her own element, although you could argue so does Hermes, because obviously you've got Mercury, but never mind. Now, Iris in more recent times is a funny one because Richard Foucault, although he was writing in 1884, claimed that Iris guided women to the afterlife when they died as Hermes guided men. So as a result, people planted irises on graves as an offering to the goddess to gain her favour. And lots of the 20th century writers that I looked at were repeating that as apparent fact, but when I'd been looking at sources which quote the original ancient Greek sources, I couldn't find any mention of Iris having that as a particular role. She's not listed as a psychopomp, at least on the website for the Theoi project. That's not listed as one of her functions. So if you know any more about that than me, then please do let me know. But we're going to switch into folk medicine now. And this is one of the really cool things about the iris, because it appears a lot in folk medicine, but it doesn't necessarily have any weird folklore attached to it. Like, you know, the mandrake, and if you pull it up, it screams. It doesn't really have anything like that. It's just useful, which is quite cool. But the Iris germanica, or bearded iris, actually grows in North Africa and Europe. And it also bloomed along riverbanks in England, which we will come back to because that is an important point. And according to Nicholas Culpeper, juice from its roots could actually ease piles. He also advised that you could make a liquor gargle from the roots to relieve toothache. And Margaret Baker picked up on that theme, suggesting that rubbing the juice of the yellow iris on a sore tooth will relieve the pain. You might have heard of orris root, which actually contains the rhizomes of Iris pallida or Iris germanica, and people might chew on that to freshen their breath after smoking tobacco or eating garlic. We are going to come back to that a little bit more in a minute, but Mildred Fielder also suggested that you could pulverise the roots of Iris versicolor to make a paste, which when applied would help to soothe wounds. And if you pulverise the rootstock and mix it with water instead, you could use it as eardrops for earache. And making a tea from the roots apparently treated lung troubles. Now, you did also need to pay attention to the root itself before you pulled it up, because if an iris root grew upwards, it would pull thorns from flesh, but if it grew downwards, then it would cure wounds. As I say, please don't go off making any of these things, like double check with reputable sources. I'm just looking at folklore here. But some of the other folklore about the orris root is quite interesting, because women actually stored it with their linen to keep away any musty smells, and people might add powdered orris root to their laundry water to give their linen a pleasing scent. And this is because parfumers actually used orris root because it smells like violets, specifically Parma violets, the sweets, and the ancients might add it to powders for both the body and face, and it's still used in high-end perfumes today because of the fact it has that violet smell. It is also really expensive as a result because the rhizomes don't actually smell when they're first harvested, so you've got to leave them like 3 or 4 years to let them gain their full aroma, and that's why it's so expensive. But Maud Grieve also suggested that you could use the juice of these roots to remove freckles, though why you'd want to is beyond me. So I did love the way that it kind of went from, yes, you can use it for all these medical things, and you can use it in cosmetics as well. So again, it just kind of makes the iris quite helpful. In the Scottish Highlands, people apparently use the roots of the Iris pseudochorus to make ink, and this particular iris, or the yellow flag iris, is also sometimes called daggers in reference to its sword-shaped leaves. So we've basically at this point got iris being used for a range of folk remedies, to perfume your laundry, to perfume yourself, or to get rid of freckles and to make ink. So that's quite a wide range of things that you can apparently use iris roots for. But it doesn't end there, because further afield, people in Iowa apparently use the iris to gauge the weather, and one woman in Cedar Falls apparently never swapped her winter underwear for summer underwear until the blue irises blossomed. And this is one of the things I think people sometimes forget about when they follow things like the Wheel of the Year, of, oh, it's now spring because we've hit this particular date. Actually looking at things seasonally where you are is probably a bit more helpful. So for this woman, then obviously she felt that spring had sort of arrived when the blue irises had come out, because it meant there was going to be a change in season, which is far more specific to her locality than just looking at a calendar. So just bear that in mind for a lot of this kind of stuff. Roy Vickery also collected a belief from Norfolk that a respondent's great-grandmother wouldn't have yellow irises inside the house. And I must admit, it's not immediately clear why that would be. So I don't know if this person had heard of the connection between irises and graves or not, I'm not sure. But there are a whole range of plants that it's actually meant to be unlucky if you bring them indoors. And obviously that includes things like primroses, hawthorn being the obvious one, and also lilac. So if anyone knows why a yellow iris shouldn't be brought inside, then please do let me know. We are going to also have a look as the iris as the fleur-de-lis. Now, I did cover this in the lily episode, but in case you can't remember or haven't listened to it, I thought it was worthwhile going back and having a look at it. And I also found an additional version of the story, so I thought, well, I'll put that in this one. So while the name fleur-de-lis translates as lily flower, some people actually think it's a stylized iris, not a lily. And according to Francois R. Velde, the fleur-de-lis actually dates back as far as Mesopotamia, and it became linked with royalty during the High Middle Ages, and it was first adopted as a heraldic motif in the 12th century by Philip II, and the fleur-de-lis also appeared on seals and coins in the 10th century. It's such a recognisable symbol, I can totally see why. Now, 14th century scholars believed that the plant was a lily, which showed that the French king was blessed by God, although scholars had actually already started to dispute this in the 17th century. And Velde points out that the early fleur-de-lis was always yellow, and wild lilies just aren't yellow, whereas the wild iris, or Iris eudocorus that we mentioned before, is yellow. And this particular plant was called the Lichtblume in German, which was sometimes spelled as Lays in the Middle Ages, and Velde suggests that the fleur-de-lis could actually refer to that yellow iris as a result. There's also a legend in which Clovis, the first king of the Franks, was heading to fight the king of Aquitania, Alaric, but he and his men got stuck trying to cross a river. Eventually they came across a Dor who fled in fright, but she crossed using a ford that she knew and reached safety. The men followed the ford that she'd used and then likewise got to safety as well. And while yellow irises grew on the opposite bank, so Clovis put one in his helmet to represent victory. Now obviously there's no evidence to suggest any of this actually happened, but it is an interesting way to explain both the choice of the fleur-de-lis and its identity as an iris, not a lily. And that might explain why the 3 petals of the flower represent wisdom, faith and valour. Other people think that the 3 petals mean prosperity, royalty and valour, and other people have even suggested it's faith, hope and charity. But there's so many of these trios you can kind of pretty much pick your favourite. Now this is where we get an alternative option, and Baker suggested a version in which there was actually yellow irises growing in the river, which showed Clovis how shallow it was, and because they could find the shallow part to cross, that's how they found the ford, so the Dor had nothing to do with it. Clovis then adopted the iris out of gratitude for its help in showing his army the way to safety. I can't help thinking that one's a little bit more likely, but again it also demonstrates that it would pretty much have to be the iris that is the fleur-de-lis, not the lily. And according to Richard Foucault in Orléans, a 7th consecutive son was known as a marcon. And obviously that's just literally where you've had 7 sons on the trot and there's no doors in between them. People believe that he would have a fleur-de-lis marked on his body somewhere as a birthmark, and if a person with the king's evil or scrofula touched this mark, or if the marcon breathed on him, the patient would be cured. Don't try that one at home. But finally, I wanted to end this episode with a bit of a peculiar iris, which is the Iris fetidissima, or stinking gladwin. And according to Roy Vickery, the plant has actually very little folklore attached to it, but it does have around 30 local names, which is quite a lot. And some of those include names like the roast beef plant or bloody bones, thanks to its awful smell. I must admit there's a hedge at the top of my front path and there's some stinking iris growing under that, and I can confirm it does smell a lot like beef. Now, I've never actually seen it flower, but it seems to produce seed pods every year, which is really peculiar as well. And you can't miss its seeds because they look an awful lot like Aramaculatum, which you might also know as lords and ladies. And stinking iris likewise gained an association with snakes, much like lords and ladies. So on the Isle of Wight, people call it snake's fiddles, while in Devon, alternative names included snake's poison, snake's food, and snake's meat. So they do look quite cool in the garden, to be honest, because obviously in the winter you then have these bright orange seed heads. But as I say, the plant itself does have a bit of a whiff about it. Now, the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford does actually have a lover's knot from Glamorgan, which was made from stinking iris leaves from around 1840, and people might use them as offerings at wishing wells. Although Vickery points out that it's actually likely someone used the leaves purely because they lent themselves to the task, rather than stinking iris being a specific choice for such an offering. So what do we ultimately make of iris folklore? Well, I think the thing that fascinated me the most while I was researching this post was the actual relative lack of folklore itself, because the iris appears in sort of folk medicine and folk remedies for its uses, whether that's in medicine, cosmetics or around the home, whereas very useful plants often have a lot of folklore, which reflects how useful they are, a bit like nettles. But here, all we have is the uses and not necessarily the lore. Now, that might be because the iris is so easy to identify, so it doesn't need folklore to show which one it is. It doesn't look like something that could be poisonous, so you don't have to have folklore telling you which one's which. Or it could well be that the involvement in the fleur-de-lis overshadows any other legends featuring the plant. And I think the links with Iris the goddess are actually more about the links with the rainbow and the different coloured irises available rather than the goddess herself. But either way, it is an absolutely beautiful plant that's well worth having in your garden, although I completely understand it if you decide to give stinking iris a miss. So please do let me know what you think of the iris. Do you grow them? Do you like them? Are you just not really bothered and a bit indifferent towards them? Please do let me know. We are looking at poppies next week, and I can't believe it's gotten to this point in the podcast and I suddenly went, do you know I've only done poppies once and it was in the episode on the folklore of sleep? So we're going to actually look at poppies properly next week. I should also point out, I've got 2 announcements basically. Both of them are good. They're not. It always sounds like it's, oh my God, I've got something to tell you. No, I don't. I'm just letting you know about a couple of things. I do have my talk on summer solstice folklore coming up, which is at the Black Gate in Newcastle on the 8th of June at 6 p.m. So if you are in town, it would be lovely to see you. We will be having a look at things like, did the ancients actually celebrate the summer solstice and how can we know? We'd be looking at how people celebrated Midsummer's Day because that's much better documented, and that's obviously June 24th. And then we'll be looking at sort of divination and magic associated with Midsummer, and we're doing it well in advance so you've got time to get prepared. So there's that. And also, oh my God, Tuesday is going to be like the most nerve-wracking day in my life. Now, I'm actually recording this on Tuesday 28th of May, so I'm like well in advance of the Saturday when this comes out. But on Tuesday the 4th of June, I'll actually be doing my PhD Viva. And if you're not sure what that involves, it basically means I've got to sit in a room with 2 people who've read my PhD thesis, one who's external to the university, the other one who's part of the university, and then basically answer their questions about it. So this is the point where I'll actually find out how I've done and whether I've passed the thing or not. So I'm going to be an absolute bag of nerves. I will let you know how it went next Saturday, but if anyone has any spare good vibes going or anything, please do feel free to wish me luck because I might need it. But anyway, I will let you go and I will see you next week when we do the folklore of poppies. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.